Hi, everyone. So these are the kind of incredible entrepreneurs we invest in at Acumen Fund. We invest patient capital in businesses in India and Pakistan and East Africa that are serving people making less than $4 a day. So when we started out doing this, it was a new idea in 2001. Jonathan talked about this a little bit, but a recent survey said that half of all investors would be interested in this idea of impact investing. And what that means is investing, taking their financial capital and putting it to work directly in solving social problems. We're about $1 billion market today, and they're saying it could grow to $120 billion or more. So I think it's worth understanding what it is. There are about 192 of these impact investing funds today. About 100 of them have been closed in the last year. And it reminds me a lot of the history of microfinance. As I'm sure all of you know, microfinance is about a $100 billion market. It's serving 100 million people today, based on the notion of giving small $50 and $100 loans, mostly to poor people and mostly to women. And if you follow the news at all, you'll notice that SKS, the largest microfinance organization in India, had an IPO, which was mentioned earlier. They raised $358 million. The IPO was 13 times oversubscribed, and it was valued at $1.6 billion for the 6 million customers that they have, with the bluest of blue chip investors, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan. And if you pay even more close attention to this sector, you'll know that last month in October in southern India, 30 people committed suicide, ostensibly because they had too many microfinance loans from too many microfinance organizations. 17 of the people who killed themselves are clients of SKS. And the New York Times today actually ran a front page story about this. So what does it mean? What it means to me is that the markets can bring good and the markets can bring ill. Without the right kind of regulation, without the right kind of oversight, and I would argue without the right kind of capital behind it, capital that cares first about impact before it cares about investing, that the markets can go too far. What I've seen as a fundraiser in this space is people are very comfortable with these two focal points, philanthropy and the market. So philanthropy, where you say, I'm going to lose 100% of my money from a financial perspective for social change. Or the market, where you're going to try to maximize your financial return and care little about social impact, if at all. And there's very little discomfort with the middle. The impact investing space is moving over to this market end of the spectrum, and the philanthropy space gets very uncomfortable when you talk about markets and returns. What I think we need to do is explore the space in the middle. Now, I began to understand this a lot better about a year ago in December, when I made a mistake. So I live in Westchester County. I take the MTA train to and from work. Anybody else? MTA? Thank you. So all of you know, it's a relentless schedule. The MTA train runs like clockwork. Now, I rush home every day, and at the end of the day, at the end of the workday, I've been known to stop conversations mid-sentence. Got a train to catch. And I didn't think anybody really noticed, and then a friend of mine, a close colleague, mentioned that she had very quietly started calling me Buzz Lightyear. Only apparently, instead of to infinity and beyond, I was saying, hey, I got to catch the 6:20 train. Now, in fairness, I think you might rush home, too, if you wanted to see these two characters. These are my kids. That's Jonah. He's a Jedi in training. Zoe will someday be a great ballerina. So it was December 8th, 2009, and I was on the S train, looking at my iPhone as I normally am, counting the minutes that I had left. Only this time, somebody asked me for money. And I did what I normally do, and what I bet you do too, pretty often. I said no. Why? Well, that's what I do in these situations, right? It's not the smart thing to do to give to a beggar on the street. Only this time, I realized I had made a mistake, and that I needed to do something about it. So the next day, I announced on my blog a generosity experiment, and for all of you looking to commit to things, I encourage you to announce them publicly before you're sure whether or not it's a good idea. The generosity experiment was very easy and very simple. For the next 30 days, I would say yes to everyone who asked. Every beggar on the street, every musician, and every nonprofit. Now, some people loved this idea, and others didn't. The people who didn't like the idea generally said something along the lines of, is this the smartest way to give? Wouldn't it be smarter to give the money to a homeless shelter? Well, to this I had two responses. First, I honestly think that's a false choice. Whether I give money to someone who's standing right there in front of me has nothing to do with whether at the end of the day I write a check to a homeless shelter. But secondly, and probably most importantly, this wasn't about the smartest and best gift I could give. This was about me. I wanted to stop saying no. You know, as someone who works at a groundbreaking nonprofit, as a fundraiser, as someone who thinks that the world's broken and in need of healing, and as someone who wanted to tap into my own motivations for doing this work, I felt like I needed to break this habit. I felt like what was going on was that I was hiding behind what was smart, and it was keeping me from doing what was right. So what happened? Before that, I'd like to ask you all a question. How many times do you think that somebody asks you for money? Do you think it's once a day? Maybe once every 2 days? Maybe you say no 4 out of 5 times. Or 9 out of 10 times. But pretty soon the no's start to add up. Pretty soon no becomes who you are and what you do when somebody comes to you asking for help. And I wanted to practice saying yes, and what I realized is I needed a new habit and a new reflex. When I want to teach my kids to say please and thank you, it requires repetition and it requires practice. And I realized I'd never once sat down in my life, despite my commitment to this work in this sector, and said, I want to practice being more generous. So what happened? Well, I did give to everyone on the street and all sorts of nonprofits, all the ones who were emailing me with the holiday campaigns, maybe some of your organizations. And what started to happen was that I started to feel like a generous person. And I started to realize that if I want the world to be more open and more action-oriented and more generous, then I have to be more open and more action-oriented and more generous. Now, I'll admit, I didn't feel good about every single gift I gave, and I'm upset that he left because this guy had the nerve to come up to me near the end of the month and ask me for $5 because he knew I had to say yes. But more seriously, I started to understand generosity in a new way, and as a fundraiser, I started to become more effective because I realized and learned and understood in a different way that the smartest and the best philanthropists, the most effective ones, they lead with generosity. That's their starting point. And what I think has happened in the nonprofit sector, especially recently, is that the knock is that there's not enough accountability, right? And I think that that's probably true, but at the same time, I think the pendulum can swing too far in the other direction. And we can start to think that the best giving of all is the most hard-headed. In the space where I work in impact investing, you see this happening more and more. More of these funds start focusing on the things that are easiest to measure. NPVs, IRRs, return on capital. And they act like there are no trade-offs. And at least for where I sit at Acumen Fund, I want to remind myself every day that we're in this business because we're trying to fight poverty. The 3 billion people in the world today whose lives are essentially unchanged for thousands of years. So what we like to talk about is this idea of patient capital. We're going to invest money in these businesses with a view to the long term and a hope that we will get the money back. But it's first and foremost about social impact. It lies between philanthropy and the market, aiming to bring together the best of generosity and accountability, the best of philanthropy and investment. So Acumen Fund has about $50 million invested in businesses in India and Pakistan and East Africa, all of them providing things like healthcare, water, housing, and energy to poor people. So what does that really mean? Well, I was in another train station in September, around Labor Day. This one's in Delhi. And once again, I was running for the train, although I swear this time it wasn't my fault. And thank goodness we got on the train just as it was starting to move out of the station, because if we'd missed it, we would have missed this nice 16-hour ride overnight from Delhi to the city of Gorakhpur, about 200 kilometers from the Nepalese border, from which we took another 2-hour drive to the town of Padrona, which is right on the border of the Indian state of Bihar. Now, Bihar, if you're not familiar with it, is the poorest state in India. 85 million people live in Bihar. They have a GDP per capita of about 10,000 rupees, which is about $200 US. So to put that in perspective, if Bihar were a state or a country in sub-Saharan Africa, it would have the second largest population and the second lowest GDP. So what does that mean? That means that 90% of the people in Bihar have no access to electricity, not surprisingly. 75 million people. And so they live like this. Now, it's a beautiful photograph. It's a romantic image. But when kerosene is your only source of light, not only do you keep it on as little as you can, but you're pretty likely one day or another to get burned like this woman did when she was 12 years old. And worse yet, the smoke from the kerosene and the smoke from the stoves will eventually kill you. 1.5 million people die every single year from indoor household smoke. That's more people than die globally from malaria. And to add insult to injury, They're spending about 10 to 15% of their income to buy these dirty fuels. Worse yet, the government of India has basically said this is a problem that's impossible to solve. 20,000 villages, about 100 million people. The government has said the grid is never going to get there because it's impossible. So when we see a problem like that, we don't aim to solve it, but man, we look for somebody who can. This is Ganesh Pandey. He's one of the co-founders of a company called Husk Power Systems. He was born and grew up in the state of Bihar, trained as an electrical engineer, came to the United States to work, but he couldn't stop thinking about this problem. How am I going to get power to the place where I grew up? He settled on the idea of rice husks, which are plentiful in Bihar. He builds these tiny little power plants, 30 kilowatts. Powers a little generator, wires up a village with a bamboo pole and a little bit of electrical wiring, and it allows him to sell electricity for $1 a month for a single light bulb. And the villages start to look like this. Now, you have to imagine what it's like to drive down one of these roads, and I'm sure many of you have, but the darkness to an unelectrified village it's like the darkness in the middle of a forest, except this is where people are living. And you get to one of these villages, it's not 1, 2, 5, 10 people who have these lights. It's 80%, 90%, 100% of a village is electrified. Now, Husk is growing very quickly. Since we invested a couple years ago, they have 51 systems up and running, serving 150,000 people. And I love showing this chart to someone who works on Wall Street, because they'll inevitably say, wow, you guys must be making so much money. Now, the reality is, and I think this is the important point, about $3 million has gone into Husk Power. Half of that is in the form of grants and subsidies. The Shell Foundation put in more than $1 million, and the Indian government has a smart subsidy set up to underwrite some of the capital costs for these systems. What that means to me is that the capital markets would and should say no to something like Husk Power. At Acumen Fund, we have the capability to say yes because we're funded mostly philanthropically and because our first criteria is about impact. So it allows us to say yes to the likes of Water Health International. Scott talked about water early this morning. They came to us in 2004 saying, we've got a way to get water to villages in India. We're going to charge people just a little bit of money to do it. And everyone said that was crazy. We put in $600,000 of equity. They're serving more than 300,000 customers. They've grown to 350 systems. But I think much more important than that is that water health has helped create a sector, 1,000 of these systems, people competing to do this because water health has blazed a path and to show what's possible. 1298 ambulances had 9 ambulances in Mumbai. When we invested $1.5 million, they grew to 70 in Mumbai, now 300 nationally, and they're growing to 1,250, taking 25,000 calls a month. They've done a lot of great things. One of them was they were the first responders to the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in November of 2008. And finally, and quickly, David Kuria, the guy who always talks about shit in any video. He had this crazy idea of building toilets throughout Kenya. You charge people 5 shillings for a clean, safe place to use the bathroom. They have 26 facilities. They've been used 6 million times, and I'm sure they're just getting started. So we say yes to these kinds of people. Now, we don't say yes without asking the tough questions, without doing all of our due diligence. But when we say yes, we say it intelligently, we say it compassionately, and we say it with a view to the long term. We feel like we're at the beginning of creating this sector, and we feel like now is our opportunity to do this right. At Acumen Fund, we're hoping to grow from $50 million invested to $250 million invested. But I think much more important than that, we aim to touch 100 million lives. We want to build this sector and build new business models that are working to serve the poor. Now, I think it's easy to look at this and say, well, we want the markets to solve this problem. And I have a business background. I came from the private sector. And I want to tell you, that's not the way I see this playing out. The way I see this playing out is the best of philanthropy, the best of government, and the right kind of investing capital all coming together. So I'll finish up with another story of the S train again. There I was. And it was March of 2010. It was a few months after the generosity experiment, and lo and behold, there's another guy on the train. He didn't seem well. I'd never seen him before. He clearly had diabetes. He had said he had just gotten out of the hospital, and he had prescriptions to fill, and he needed money. I stood up, and I gave that guy $20. Now, $20 isn't much money, really, but I promise you, in that exact situation, it certainly feels like a lot. And I'm positive if it hadn't been for this generosity experiment, I never would have done that. I never would have done it if I hadn't decided in advance how I was going to behave in that situation and letting that decision in advance inform my actions. Now, of course, I'm never going to know if the money that I gave to that guy made a difference. And I know that all of you, just like I in my day job, are going to ask a lot more tough questions before giving money to someone. There's a risk involved in taking that leap. I think that what we forget too often in the nonprofit sector is that philanthropy is about risk-taking. Because of the kind of capital that we have, and because we're solving problems that have never been solved before, we have the flexibility to take risks that others won't take. And what I encourage all of you to do is to take these risks with asking as many tough questions as you can, being as tough as you can, being as hard-nosed as you can, as much of a business attitude as you can have. But at the same time, please be as generous as you can be. Thanks.
This conference has been absolutely amazing.
Everything was just wonderful for me. I enjoyed it so much.
Far exceeded my expectations.
The speakers were incredible. The other people that I met just networking were really inspiring.
It's very exciting.
I think it's very innovative.
I thought it was great.
Learned a lot and look forward to coming back and bringing a lot of other people with me next year.
I've come all the way from the UK to attend the Next Gen Charity Conference.
The Next Gen Charity Conference has been really awesome to come together with other people in the field and kind of talk about the changing landscape.
I think the highlight for me was not so much a particular speaker, but the full range of different speakers and the fact that they were quite provocative. They were asking people to go a little bit further than normal. It wasn't people sharing the results and their ideas on how to keep moving the wheel a little bit. They were really asking people to push and break the mold. And sometimes that can be hot air. These guys had actually walked the talk.
They've really brought together a bunch of different ideas and different types of nonprofit challenges all into one.
I'm just very excited by the possibilities that I've seen here.
Authors of books that I have read, now they're up there speaking right to me. I felt like they were speaking right to me and my organization and how they could help, me personally.
If anybody's thinking about coming to this conference, they're going to learn a lot and take away a lot of encouragement and very practical principles.
I think the conference has been excellent. I think it's very inspiring. I think it's very well done. I think it's very professionally run.
I think this conference is bringing together a lot of creative people who need to talk to each other and share ideas and stay inspired.
So far the conference has been awesome. It's been extremely interesting.
Seth Godin summarized it well. It's about people taking the ideas and acting on them when they go back to work on Monday morning.
The conference is great. It's an opportunity to meet a lot of really interesting individuals who have accomplished a lot.
They had a high caliber of speakers, people who know what they're talking about, who've been in the industry for a while, and who are actually seeing where the trends are heading and where we're leading. So I think it definitely was worth the investment and the travel from Georgia to get here.
It was fantastic.
I would definitely recommend it for someone who's getting going in this field and wants to make a difference.
So I would really recommend this to any organization that was trying to take a really good outside look at themselves and kind of maybe think anew about how they're structured and how they're achieving their mission.
The roster of speakers was really excellent, and there were a lot of people who I wanted to hear their story and how they got where they got and where they're going.
And I really think it kind of evokes the TED conference and the TED Talks, where you're getting this stellar lineup of thinkers and innovators to come and share everything from very quirky stories about how they got their start to how they're doing business every day and the very important lessons that they're learning that are really applicable.
You guys have to come to this conference next year. People normally spend thousands of dollars to have an opportunity to hear speakers like Seth Godin, Chris Forbes, Scott Harrison. To spend just a few $100s and have this networking opportunity, you cannot pass this up next year. Make sure you're here.
It just was such a wonderful experience. And it was everything I was hoping and plus a whole lot more.